Good morning or good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. Thanks so much for joining us for this week's webinar in our series on global security. And this webinar is actually our closing roundtable. So we're very excited to be here and think about the future or the futures in plural of global security. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Annette Idler. I'm the director of the Global Security Programme at Pembroke College and faculty member here at the Blavatnik School of Government. And before we start, I'd like to express my thanks to those who've made this webinar series possible. So first of all, the DT Institute, which provides general support for the series, Blavatnik School of Government and Pembroke College, and also the Minerva Research Initiative, which is the co-host here. I also would like to thank my team who has made all of this possible, especially Frederick, who coordinated everything behind the scenes and who really has put a lot of effort into all of that. We started the webinar series last term in Hillary term. So we had 7 sessions so far, and this is now the final one, the closing roundtable to bring everything together. And as I've explained also in previous sessions, the purpose of the webinar series is to explore the meaning and practice of global security. So it forms part of the research program here on global security, in which we study how global security emerges from the dynamic interactions of 3 dimensions. That refers to, first of all, the political dimension of global security. And by that, I mean especially global order and geostrategic power. We also look at the economic dimension, that is supply chains, and not just licit global supply chains, but also illicit supply chains and the networks of transnational licit and illicit supply chains. And then we also look at the social dimension, that is especially the local experiences of stability or instability in contested spaces. And in each of the sessions, we've brought together both academics and policymakers or practitioners from around the world to make sure that our intellectual engagement helps also tackle real-world security challenges. And it has been a really, really fruitful webinar series, I would say, with really insightful discussions. And I'd like to just share some of the insights that we had in the previous sessions to also pick up on those themes today in our discussion that we're going to have. So in the opening roundtable, which really brought us to think about whether there is actually such a concept as global security, or whether it is more of an umbrella term that refers to many other concepts of security, like international security, national security, or human security. On that occasion, we discussed, among others, how nation states are isolating their security policies and become more protectionist. We also looked at a kind of a long-term horizon, starting from empires to where we are today, and how the meaning of security has shifted throughout that time. We then moved on to discuss different methodologies and epistemologies that can help us understand global security. And among others, one of the insights here was that it's important to have an interdisciplinary approach to the study and practice of global security, because it does help to incorporate the voices of not just national actors, but also transnational actors, of local actors. It might even be an entry point helping to empower some of these actors. And therefore, it's really important to have those different approaches. Also, in terms of methodologies, we looked at quantitative approaches, qualitative approaches, but also how the arts, humanities, or data science can help. We then moved on to discuss the different scales and spaces of global security. And here it was quite clear that global security cannot be studied only at the global level, but actually needs to consider how regional and local experiences of insecurity matter and how we can also scale up from them to the global level. So that refers to the study, but of course also security practices at the global level need to be able to scale down to also consider or have an impact or influence on the local level. So it's really about the glocal or the continuum of between the local and the global that is relevant. And then we went on to look at each of the dimensions in more detail. So the political dimension, the economic dimension, and also the social dimension. And across those sessions, some of the points that came out was around the way we think about it, the time horizons we use. So for example, that short-term thinking and fear-mongering can actually negatively affect the implementation of solutions to global security issues, which of course need to be considered in a more long-term horizon. Another point that came out of those discussions was that securitization, or some would argue the over-securitization of certain issues, may actually in the long run lead to more insecurity, because it produces this atmosphere for fear and also justifies unsustainable spending of resources, both the economic and in terms of the economy and in terms of the environment. And then when we thought about kind of the solutions or how to change things, how to address things, it was clear that proper global governance structures need to be put in place. And here, one important point was that such structures need to address not only security issues, but need to be really, really adjusted to what is at stake. As I said before, it's not always about security. And of course, also need to consider what basically are justice issues rather than security issues. So overall, there was at times a little bit of a sense of pessimism among the panelists in terms of the prospects of resolving global security issues. However, some of the avenues to get there could really be a better understanding of the interactions of those different, first of all, of the different scales of security. So think through what the impact of that might be, and then also getting a better understanding of how those different dimensions interact. And that, of course, can be done by also integrating different epistemologies and methodologies. So this was kind of a brief overview. I mean, there was much more in there and will be available later on our website as well. But I think it's quite good to keep that in mind when we come to the discussion of today in terms of thinking about the future or the futures of global security. Now, of course, we also are interested in hearing from our audience members, and that's why, like every week, we've also prepared a quick poll and would like to ask you to respond to that. So you can see this right now here hopefully on your screen, and please tick with whatever you agree most. So the question is, or the statement is, that threats to global security are primarily the product of, is it political interests by states? Is it economic interests by private actors? Is it the failure of governments to address people's grievances? Or the failure of the international order and international institutions to address key challenges? Or is it actually a combination of the above? And if you think that there's anything missing here that we definitely should also consider, then please send us an email, write us a comment, and we'll work with that as well. So I see already now here from the results that looks like most people think that it is a combination of several options. Some point to the failure of governments to address people's grievances, the political interests, not so much about the failure of international order or economic interests. So that's quite interesting. In previous sessions, we had people who were felt much stronger about economic interests as well. And what we'll do is at the end, we'll compare the results from the different sessions. So with that, I'd like to now turn to our distinguished panelists. And I'm really thrilled to have three experts here with me in the virtual room, which I think can give us also very, very diverse perspectives. So first of all, let me introduce Joanne Crouch. And just to reassure everyone, she is here in the room. She just is unable to show her video, but she's here and we'll hear her speak. So thanks so much for joining us, Joanne. Joanne Crouch is the Policy and Strategy Lead for Human Security on behalf of the UK Ministry of Defence, delivering both a change programme to integrate human security across the whole of defence, as well as leading on key aspects of human security policy. And one of the key elements is understanding how the pursuit of human security can draw strategic gains as we shift into an era of global competition. Before she joined the MOD, Joanne has been working on conflict transformation, both as a consultant and also in NGOs. She has decades-long experiences, mainly focused on East Africa, primarily Somalia, but she's also worked a lot on human rights and conflict analysis, peace building across Palestine, Israel, Colombia, and also post-conflict Guatemala. So thanks so much for joining us, Joanne, and providing the practitioner perspective here in this discussion. Then let me turn to our next speaker, Fifi Edouard-Foul. and he is here to speak on behalf of Professor Kwesi Anang, who unfortunately is unable to join us because of a last very commitment on very short notice. Oh, I see him joining now as well. That's even better. We have now two representatives. So let me first of all introduce Professor Kwesi Anang. He's the Director, Faculty of Academic Affairs and Research at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center in Ghana. He's also Clinical Professor of Peacekeeping Practice at the Kennesaw State University in Atlanta. And Kwesi has served with the African Union from 2005 to 2007. He was the first continental expert on the Common African Defense and Security Policy and counterterrorism located in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and was responsible for the African Center for the Study and Research on Terrorism. He also served as senior consultant to the Department of Political Affairs at the UN, and was involved in the report for the Security Council on the relationship between the UN and regional organizations, especially the African Union. I'm also introducing Fifiedu Aful. Thanks so much for being ready on such a short notice. It's fantastic to have you here with us as well. Fifiedu Aful is a research fellow and deputy program head of the Peace Support Operations Program, also at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center. He was an adjunct lecturer at the Department of Political Science and Rhodes University in South Africa. He also serves as a faculty member on the MA program in Defense and International Politics at the Ghana Armed Forces Command and Staff College. And he has nearly 10 years of experience in authoring, teaching, and facilitating work on conflict, peace, and security. So thank you so much for joining us. And then last but not least, I'm delighted to introduce Professor James Forrest, professor in the School of Criminology and Justice Studies at the University of Lowell, Massachusetts, where he teaches undergraduate, master's, and doctoral degree courses on contemporary security studies, on terrorism, on counterterrorism, homeland security, weapons of mass destruction, and other related topics. He is the director of the Security Studies program, and he's the editor-in-chief of the journal Perspectives on Terrorism, for which I have the privilege of serving on the editorial board. I can only recommend the journal. He has previously served as a senior fellow for the U.S. Joint Special Operations University and as faculty member of the United States Military Academy. He has served as an expert witness for terrorism-related court cases and has provided testimony and briefings to the intelligence community and committee hearings of the U.S. Senate. So I think it's very clear that we have very distinguished panelists here, experts on the topic. And I'd like to just, without further ado, just turn to you and really hear your thoughts and given your expertise on the future of global security. So let me start with James, if that is okay, and ask you, what's your view on global security, if we think about it since the start of the war on terror? So since that moment, 9/11 and what came afterwards, in your view, how has the global security landscape changed? And where is it heading?
Yeah,
that's as simple as that, as easy as that.
Easy as that, yes. So summarize 12, 13 years worth of global security changes, no problem. Yeah, so I kind of broke it down in my notes to a small list of categories, I guess. One category would be new technologies, drones, financial, cryptocurrency, dark web, encrypted communications, cyber threats. We've seen an increase in malware. We've seen an increase in the ability of our adversaries to steal sensitive information, attack critical infrastructure like the Colonial Pipeline here in the US. So technology is one area that we've seen a lot of changes in global security, and that's going to continue, I think, especially with generative AI and those types of things coming on. Lone actors have been inspired and empowered more increasingly here in the US and in Europe for terrorist attacks. We've seen some intersections of that lone actor space for terrorism and also technology in the guise of, say, Brenton Tarrant and his attack in New Zealand being live streamed. We've seen lone actors like the Tsarnaev brothers here in Boston, the Boston area in 2013, Anders Breivik in Oslo, Norway. So the lone actor terrorism problem has certainly grown and expanded. We've seen a growth of far-right extremism, somewhat related to that terrorism thing I just mentioned, more violence related to far-right extremist ideologies. We've seen some Russian aggression in the last 10, 15 years, especially regarding the use of digital influence warfare, which is something I've written a lot about. 2016 elections, 2018, 2020, that I think is going to continue, both in terms of state-sponsored digital influence efforts and also mercenaries, individuals who are paid by great powers or wannabe great powers to attack their adversaries in the digital space. We've also seen mercenaries in the non-digital space in terms of Wagner Group. Russia's Wagner Group has been involved in Africa, Syria, Ukraine. So we've seen sort of an empowered, violent non-state actors, both in terms of terrorism and irregular warfare, and also in terms of mercenaries. And then finally, China. The military growth we've seen in China over the last 20 years, aggressively claiming territory in the Pacific, oppressing dissent in Hong Kong, threatening Taiwan, those sorts of things. So there's a lot that's gone on over the last 20 years or so. Some of it's related to terrorism, which is an area that I focus a lot on, but a lot of it's now shifting our focus towards the emergence of what some people call great power competition between China and Russia and the US. So those are some highlights, I guess, in terms of categorical items, but I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks. I guess we could have a whole workshop or webinar on each of the topics you just mentioned, but it's great to get this this broad overview. I'd like to just pick up where you ended with, which was the great power competition, which of course is something that we see increasingly. You mentioned also Russian aggression, you mentioned China, and let me turn to Joanne, where of course you are working a little bit at the interface of thinking about human security, but then also a great power competition. From your point of view, what would you say are the implications of this increased great power competition and the revival also of protectionism for global security? And of course, bringing in also here your practitioner lens, and over to you.
Thanks, and just apologies for not being able to have a video. The workplace doesn't really allow it. What are the implications of great power competition? I'm going to look at it through the lens of for human security. I think it can cut in two ways, really. On the one hand, I mean, we are ever more reliant on our partners and our allies. So whilst we think about kind of reverting into this kind of closed protectionist space, there's a balance to that. We have to maintain our alliances, and our alliances are both very much defensive based, they're economic based, but they're also values based. And when we're looking at retaining our alliances with democratic countries, human security becomes quite intrinsic to that. What we've seen in the history of over the last 20, 30 years has demonstrated that where Western powers, whether that's the UK or the US, when we are going into other countries, when we are being disregarding to the human security of local populations, when we're taking that global chauvinistic approach, even if we're framing it as a defensive action, that doesn't build bonds, it doesn't build stability, it doesn't build prosperity, and actually it undermines us domestically. And we're seeing that now in terms of the way that, the US have got their civilian harm mitigation action plan, which is like $42 million, which is being invested into that, thinking about how they mitigate against civilian harm in their future activities. The UK has got their human security and defense policy and 12-year change program to get defense to start thinking strategically about this, because actually if you build and if you use human security not just as an end objective in what you want to achieve, but also as a consideration that we need to think about when engaging overseas, when prosecuting our national security interests overseas, but also we'll use it as a vehicle for defense engagement, for building relations, solidifying our partnerships. Actually, that can be a really, really beneficial tool for, whilst we're going into this era of great power competition, we need to shore up our alliances. And human security is a valuable lever to doing that with. At the same time, I mean, whilst we talked about China's very aggressive tactics in places such as Taiwan and Hong Kong, and certainly domestically, on the international stage, they're in a bit of a compromised position as well. On the one hand, they want to build their alliances, they want to garner strategic advantage in many parts of the world, and not least of all Africa. But there are limits and boundaries to what they can do. They are still quite sensitive to public critiques. When they have seen that actually kind of aggression or abuses of human rights, whether it's by their companies, has worked against them or works to undermine both their reputation, let alone their profit margins or their economic opportunities, they have been responsive. So yes, great power competition does put some challenges on the table, and we've seen that certainly through Russian behavior in Ukraine. But at the same time, for the likes of the Western alliance that we're seeing through NATO and our partners, and also for China, it's not quite clear that actually kind of we need to be undermining human security to get ahead, and actually kind of some concern over populations, stability, peace, as we've seen with China's diplomacy and support for the Iran-Saudi Arabia détente. Actually, human security might be a valuable vehicle for powers on either side of gaining strategic advantage. So it's not all doom and gloom in my view.
Thanks. Glad to hear that there's some optimism here as well. Now we've heard, I guess, both from John and from James, obviously, about the great power competition, and that's also reflected in, I guess, in policy documents. If we think about the US National Defense Strategy, China is a concern, Russia as well. If we think about the Integrated Review Refresh in the UK, that talks about state threats, it also talks about transnational security challenges, but it is pretty center stage. On that basis, I'd like to turn to Fifi and hear from you, if from your perspective, also thinking about the African continent and the influence there of groups like mercenaries, as we heard before, but also other security challenges, if you would coincide with that interpretation, or if from your perspective, perhaps some of the future challenges are actually quite different. So please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Annette, for the kind introduction and also for the invitation to join this webinar. So in terms of the question that you asked, I just want to sort of push my thoughts or my thinking around how global society faces immediate and long-term threats to peace and security, and to see how academics and also practitioners have critical roles to play in examining the current state of the world. And in thinking through that, I sort of focused on 5 key areas. What is at stake if we do think creatively and also generate new solutions? How do we restructure our approaches to appreciate future global challenges? And then the third question that I stick to ask myself is, what are some of the primary challenges in terms of human, national, transnational, environmental, and also transcultural security dimensions? And then the fourth question that I stick to ask myself is, how can academics and practitioners think imaginatively to produce novel solutions, and importantly, to streamline methodologies to first understand the current global security challenges, and then second, also to respond to it. Then finally, the question that I stick to ask myself is, how can academics structure knowledge that can benefit from old ideas and old ways of doing things, or how can it open institutions and practitioners to new influences? So in asking these 5 questions, I sort of the questions actually translate into concrete points that capture these challenges that we foresee in future. And in generating knowledge, both academics and practitioners have to understand the effects of their actions, their designs, and how they can adapt to plans to rapidly respond to the changing trends within the global space, and understand the perspectives that the objectives of multiple actors can combine to be able to respond to the challenges within the global security landscape. So I categorize my analysis into 3 key issues: the factors, the actors, and then also the security challenges. So now let's look at the factors. We are looking at the complexity of the situation. We are looking at issues around urbanization, issues of climate change, interdependence, technology and innovation leading to disruptive change. So we are talking about cybersecurity, ICT, AI, and also we're looking at the demographic shift with Global South as the center of gravity, say in the year 2050. Then now let's look at the actors. Here you're looking at the US in relative decline, the rise of China and its assertiveness, multipolarity at the regional and the global level, less relevant and capable international organizations, but I must say that they are very, very necessary and relevant. Weak and failed states, non-state political, ideological, and religious actors, and then also criminalized political structures. So if you look at these factors and actors, then what do we postulate to be the future security challenges? We are looking at conflicts over global common, instability from economic, demographic disruptions, global power competition over issues around counterterrorism, violent extremism, environmental disruptions, mass migration for survival and a better life, leading to different types of conflicts. We are looking at governance challenges manifesting in democratic reversals, as we've seen in most of African states, hybrid and unconventional wars, a shift from war to peace boundaries with the risk to civil populations. We've seen also how pandemics has also turned out. And then weapons of mass destruction. And here I'm looking at strongly issues of small arms and light weapons. For we as academics, I think we need to think about the forms of knowledge generation and how this knowledge generation would help us to respond to the challenges that we foresee in future. So those are my brief comments.
Thank you so much. Thanks. That's very helpful to think through what these factors are, the actors and security challenges. And you already pointed here to something that I guess speaks also to the other panelists' comments, the multipolarity, which is important in thinking about how power more generally shifts. I'd like to just connect back to also John's point about using human security. And I'd like to turn to you again, James, knowing that you work also on homeland security. And I wonder, what's your view on those different concepts? If we think about security at the global level that concerns both political entities, but also people, how can we deal with this tension of thinking about security as something that is domestic, homeland security versus human security, or is there another more general term? So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that, and of course also feel free to react to any of the other comments.
Yeah, I think one of the things that would unite all these different levels of security that are being discussed, whether it's global security, national security, homeland security, or even human security, personal security, is the word uncertainty. Uncertainty fuels a lot of insecurity at all those different levels. So the most that countries do to reduce uncertainty can mitigate and alleviate some of that insecurity across all those different dimensions. And so in terms of insecurity and uncertainty about where your next meal is coming from, whether or not you have to fear the law enforcement taking your family away into some dark hole somewhere and never be seen again. Uncertainty about whether or not the economy is going to be able to support jobs for your children when they grow old enough. All those kinds of levels of insecurity at the human basic family level. That's kind of one level. And then you move up to the homeland security. We have uncertainty about the impact of crime and technologies and immigration and all those kinds of things as well. At the national level, we have insecurity and uncertainty about what China's intentions are, what Russia's intentions are, what other adversaries or potential adversaries, their intentions and capabilities might be. So that's the role of intelligence community agencies across the entire world, is to reduce uncertainty. So they gather information, they analyze that information to try and reduce that uncertainty and hopefully mitigate or reduce the likelihood of military conflict or violent conflicts or whatever. So, those kind of things all kind of boil down to that one word, uncertainty. And so if we can analyze the uncertainty, reduce the uncertainty, and address uncertainty at the human level and also at the homeland level and the national level, I think is one area to focus on.
Thanks so much. Really, really interesting point to think about uncertainty and how uncertainty, of course, produces also negative perceptions of security. So it ties into the kind of the themes that we discussed in the previous webinars about the difference between perceptions and threat perceptions, right, versus what actually is a threat. and the fear mongering that is often happening. So thinking about the perceptions that are often negative because of uncertainty is certainly very, certainly, the uncertainty is certainly very, very important to consider. Joanne, would you like to come in here and just share with us a little bit more in terms of how you would integrate or include this notion of uncertainty when thinking about global security, but also perhaps what else, like moving beyond just great power competition, where you see human security as a useful lens, or how we can also combine that with other concepts, which probably are not, or the way at least we look at it is that they're not mutually exclusive. So it would be great to hear your thoughts. And again, feel free to react to any of the other comments.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's that last phrase that you said, that they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, when I talk about human security, I mean, human security is a positive interpretation of that, but really we're talking about vulnerabilities in the population. And our starting point is recognizing that the security of the state and the security of populations are fundamentally intertwined. You know, we can't think about the security of the state in isolation from the security of populations therein. And when we start to then think about the security of the state, well, we live in a global world with global interaction, so we can't consider the security of the individual state in isolation from security at the global level. So whilst the term and the notion of human security tries to make us think, you know, at this really, really hyper local level of the individual experience, actually kind of there's a real link between that hyper local lived experience of populations and the global security competition dynamics. You know, even at the state level, we need to think about, you know, if there are vulnerabilities in a population, whether there is, you know, that's a result of climate change threatening food security, job security, economic security, you know, are these being leveraged by insurgent groups, extremist groups to mobilize insurgencies? You know, when we think about great power competition and the way that Russia has played things in Ukraine, Russia has exploited vulnerabilities in our own population here in the UK. I mean, Russia has gone, okay, we are a democratic state, and in a democracy, the vulnerability is its human population. You leverage that vulnerability through escalating energy insecurity, power insecurity, especially going into a harsh winter. I mean, the intention behind that is that, you know, the population, they will have an uptick in the cost of living, and they'll feel the pressure and escalate democratic pressure on a government to refrain from investing and spending money into a war effort in Ukraine, because they know that actually the population is instrumental as to how the government is going to conduct itself on the global stage in these great power competitions. So I think it's really important that we don't see human security in isolation from, you know, what takes place at the state level, what takes place at that global power level. I think we also need to consider multipolarity. You know, I think that was mentioned earlier, and we need to consider that we have this great power competition, but we also have multipolarity going on in between. And maybe I'm slightly digressing here when I hear that term, because I think whilst we focus a lot on China, Russia, the West, we also need to understand that these middle ground states, they're actually going to increase in importance, and some of them aren't naive to that. And some of them are going to start leveraging the fact that they are going to be contested spaces for their own strategic benefit. We're going to see countries maybe use a bit of an extroversion tactic to go, okay, well, actually, if you want me to align to you, what are you going to give me? So I don't think it's all going to be a case of great power competition means that you've got these unilateral dominances coming from either the West or from China. I think there's going to be some middle ground contestation there, which means that you've got some of these middle ground states that can actually start going, well, actually, you want my vote, you're going to have to court it. So I think I'm digressing slightly, but I don't think that the great power competition, it's just going to be so unilaterally focused around China, the UK, the West. I think there's going to be a lot of grey zones in between where contestation is going to take place, and we're not going to see what's happened in years gone by, whereby countries have to kowtow. I think there's going to be a little bit more leverage there than maybe we've realized, and that's going to push and demand more and better for those countries. The question is whether that's going to be more and better for those countries, or whether that's going to be more and better for those elites and leaders alone.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Joanne. So you mentioned, I'm using a little bit now the categories, Fifi, that you introduced about the actors and the security challenges. So you both now mentioned that basically it's not just about great powers. Joanne, you pointed to the fact that there are these, what you call middle ground states, or perhaps the emerging market democracies. It's not always helpful to think just about a global north-south divide. So there are countries in the African continent, for example, like Nigeria or South Africa, that would fall into that category. So Fifi, from your point of view, what do you think? What is the role of these actors, and how might that also shift over time? But then also with regard to the security challenges that we see, I mean, of course, we talk about now the state actors, we talk about the individuals that are affected, communities, but we've also raised the point about non-state actors like Wagner, that is also influential in Africa. I mean, criminal actors, we know especially West Africa is hugely impacted by being on the transit zone of the illicit drug trade, for example. So there's other challenges, these transnational challenges that affect the African continent as well. And then, of course, thinking about the solutions, we also need to consider regional actors like the African Union, and even the private sector. So bringing those into the picture, the middle ground states or emerging market democracies, the African Union, private actors, on the one hand, as those who are, I guess, either fueling insecurity or hopefully working on solutions, but then also bringing in other security challenges like those created or caused by non-state actors. What's your view here, Fifi? And is there something perhaps that we can also learn from the African continent?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think, the role of middle states within resolving issues of security on the African continent has been very well pronounced. We remember the role that Nigeria played critically in the three conflicts in West Africa, in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and in Cote d'Ivoire, and to a very large extent, the role that South Africa has played in the SADC region. And if you look at all of their capabilities in helping to resolve the security challenges on the continent, you would say that they've done quite a very useful job. But they are also now confronted with a number of challenges. I mean, a number of the challenges that are being confronted by, say, Nigeria in the West Africa region perhaps explains why we have not been very frontal in dealing with some of the security situations in the Sahara region, for instance, because obviously, if you look at what happened in the year 2000s, where Nigeria was heavily involved in the security operations in the West African sub-region, did not have the same clout now. They are confronted with many challenges internally, and some have actually said that perhaps because we do not have a very strong Nigeria, for instance, that is why the security situation in the Sahel keep on thriving. But the reality is that regional organizations like ECOWAS, like SADC, like the AU have an important role to play in some of the security challenges that we are confronted with on the continent. As to whether they have the capacity and the capability to be able to engage on that score is another thing to engage with. Perhaps their lack of response, prompt response into dealing with some of these issues, perhaps have opened up the space for other ad hoc arrangements to be emerging in recent times, like, for instance, the G5 Sahel, the Accra Initiative, and then also the MNJTF, in response to the lack of this very sophisticated regional bodies' inability to respond to some of the challenges that we are confronted with on the continent. But moving forward, I think even for these regional actors, what we need to move from is to look at it in terms of the people, the citizens. How are we able to rope them into the security situation? How are we able to build support that deals and responds to their needs? Moving away from, say, an ECOWAS of states or an AU of states to an AU of individuals, where the focus or the focus of the analysis is the individual, is the citizens, and are the citizens within those networks. And for me, that is where we need to focus on in some of these the challenges that we are confronted, because whether you look at it from the very global or to the very regional or to the very national levels, most of these issues are very, very, very basic, and they are at the vulnerabilities of the individuals and communities in question. So we need to have that kind of symbiotic relationship where, even though we're looking at the states, the focus is also on the individuals, on the communities and societies within which we are seeking to protect and secure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. I have some questions here from the audience, and also everyone feel free to put something in the chat, in the Q&A. But first of all, I wanted to check if anyone would like to react on each other's comments. Any observations? Direct observations here? No? Then, or yes? No? Okay, then I move forward with here some of the questions that I've been receiving. Here is one for James. The question here is, in assessing uncertainty, what might some of the pitfalls or biases be that might skew our perception of uncertainty? So how do we deal with those biases?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's biases in all kinds of different analyses that feed into political decisions at all levels. It's a tough one. There's really no answer that would apply across the board. It takes responsibility and flexibility, thoughtfulness, open-mindedness to try and break out of those what I call influence silos. Basically, you surround yourself with individuals who think like you do or believe certain things about the world that you believe, and then you tend to refute and ignore competing or contradictory information. That is a mistake that many nations need to avoid. Nations leaders, need to avoid. One of the things that I think good leaders do is surround themselves with folks who think differently. Folks who have a different perspective about global security, national security, human security, and allow them to challenge you. And I think that in a democracy, especially, it's a lack of political will to some degree for individuals willing to surround themselves with people who challenge them. But I would like to see more political leadership that has the sort of strength of purpose to be able to not surround themselves with individuals who have the same kind of mindset that they have, but rather to entertain contradictory, competing perspectives and allow those perspectives to be aired. That's a political decision that individuals need to make going forward in leadership positions. Activism, political opposition, political activism, protests, nonviolent protests, those kinds of things are ways that those of us who aren't in political leadership positions can express our views, and given the space to express those views, hopefully that has some impact on the debate in Congress or in other kinds of democratic institutions. And finally, I would just say, we have to do a lot better in terms of educating populations about media literacy, avoiding disinformation, avoiding misinformation. There's tons of that now all over the social media and all over online, and that is unfortunately fueling the creation and the sort of strengthening of these influence silos. That I think is a mistake. I think the more we can address how people approach online information and question whether or not the information they have before them is valid and is supported by evidence and facts, as opposed to individuals who are in political positions who claim to have their own facts. We can't progress as a democratic society if that's allowed. So there has to be some responsibility in terms of those who have power to make those kind of decisions.
Thank you so much. Thanks. You've pointed to some of the ways in which everyone can engage, right? You said, we need to think about activism, protests, about just educating the general public in terms of media literacy. And that, of course, is something to try and change perhaps the perceptions or the narratives of leaders. That leads me to a question that is now for Joanne, which is a little bit about what do we do when there are clashing perceptions or security interests, even among the population. So what is it that is at stake? And that also links back to what we discussed last week on securitizing everything, right? If someone feels insecure because of a certain issue and feels that needs to be raised, the stakes need to be raised, well, what do we do if other people then disagree? And who is then the one who's actually deciding on that? So the question here that I've received for Joanne is, how can we reconcile clashing security interests at different spatial levels? And here the examples that were given are, for example, the need for rare earth materials for climate-friendly technology may harm those living in areas where mining occurs. So we also, of course, need to reconcile that both at the different spatial levels. I would add to that, we need to reconcile kind of the short-term benefits with the long-term benefits. Joanne, would you like to respond to that question?
Thank you. That's not an easy question. I think in terms of clashing or competing security concerns, I think, ultimately, our own security, our national security, for example, and when I talk about the UK, our national security, part of that is contingent upon our future energy security. Part of that is contingent upon the use of renewables and shifting away from hydrocarbons. We've already accepted that. But in order to do that, we are reliant upon rare earth minerals, which are derived from countries such as the DRC or parts of West Africa and parts of Africa, which are going to be heavily contested. And I think this is the kind of debates that we're having at this moment in time. How do we have strategic access to the kind of resources that we require, knowing that we're not going to be the only country that requires that, whilst also going, okay, in order to have that strategic access, we need to make sure that we're managing and mitigating risks of conflict in the area that we want to draw those minerals from. And what we've seen time and time again is that the most effective hydrocarbon extraction is done when you're not escalating conflict risks and insecurity in the location that you're at. What we've found is that when conflict goes up, your ability to be profitable, your ability to actually mine and conduct some of those activities can, if conflict gets too great, can actually go down. We've seen that as an incentive to push Chinese mining companies or Chinese hydrocarbon companies in South Sudan, for example, to be more conflict sensitive and be more thoughtful about how it's operating in those spaces. We've seen a history and a legacy of how we've had to implement and push domestically our hydrocarbon companies and extractive companies to be more conflict sensitive. So I think there is a track record in trying to think about how we can be more conflict sensitive in those locations. Being conflict sensitive can give us strategic access. But at the same time, if we know that we're going to be competing for those resources with other states and global competitors, we need to stop thinking about competition as absolutist. Are we going to dominate to the absolute exclusion of others? Because actually that's going to be the thing that is going to push adversaries into wanting to take militant action. And so I think we need to think about what is enough for us, what resource share do we need to have to support our own growth? How can we do that with due consideration to populations in the area where we're trying to extract those resources, and making sure that what we're doing is, protecting our interests, but not doing so to the extent that we're actually antagonizing adversaries in ways that would push them to mobilize violent conflict against us, or conflict or threaten our security through sub-threshold or hybrid means as an alternative. So I think there's a lot of thinking going into, and strategic thinking going into, well, how do we protect our security? How do we protect the security of others? But also we need to protect ourselves, but not to the extent that it antagonizes adversaries who, backed into a corner, people will fight back. I don't think we've necessarily got all the answers to that yet, and I don't think that's necessarily an easy thing to apply. But I think that, in the debates that I see within defence and within the security institutions, there is a lot of thinking going on towards those issues.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Yeah, you raised important points about thinking how to deal with resources. And of course, I mean, the example here was minerals, but we also know that the type of resources that are strategic will shift over time, right? So we're still thinking about oil in the Middle East, for example, right now, but in 20, 30 years, rare minerals will become even more important. Coltan, cobalt, lithium, these will be the resources that are every time more important for new technologies. The topic we started with James' contribution, how that is developing, and that's why we need those resources, batteries. That also then means that, of course, the locations of conflict, of insecurity will shift, because we now discover them in new places, in new locations, which of course also disrupts local spaces and the populations residing in them. So that's one factor, not just how we are competing over resources, but also what the locations are, the environments, the places where those resources are embedded. And of course, water is another key factor that has been important already as a security issue, but of course will also be important in the future. Fifi, would you like to comment on that, talking about the point of resources, resource extraction, and what that means for security?
Yes, I mean, I think we know that in most of the conflicts that we've had on the African landscape, I mean, at the base of most of the conflict has been the issue of resources. And we know how gold, we know how cocoa, we know how timber, oil, and a number of these resources have been the bane of some of the countries that have been the host of some of these resources. I mean, there's a reason why Congo has never known peace, obviously because of how resourceful that country is. So there's that kind of relationship between the kinds of resources that we have, and then also the new kinds of conflicts that we are having within the African landscape. And also the connect between these resources, when we identify these resources and how they are extracted from the communities and how sometimes the communities feel left out. And I think it also ties in nicely with the conversation around security, because around issues of human security at the heart of that, food security, all of those kinds of discussions, environmental security, and the likes. All of these are quite important issues that we need to be able to connect to it. We've seen how almost all of the communities that have identified some kind of resource of furniture have been at conflict with those who are drawing out these resources. I mean, not too long ago, Ghana, for instance, I struck oil, and there was a huge conflict between the communities where this oil was struck, and then also the states, because for the communities, their livelihood was threatened. I mean, they couldn't farm in certain areas. They couldn't go to certain areas that typically they could go, obviously, because either they were flaring gas or these multilateral companies have taken over those spaces and have made it very difficult for the communities to basically live. So we need to be able to look at those kinds of natural resource, the abundance of natural resource, and also the connection to conflict. And I think once we are able to resolve this connection, then we'll be able to deal with some of the challenges that come towards dealing with the exigencies of having these resources within the various localities within which we find ourselves.
Thanks so much. Thanks. Yeah, I guess not just the relevance of resources for conflicts, but also then looking at the global level, how it also fuels, again, more grievances, it radicalizes people, which then may also lead to more terrorist threats. Another point that James, of course, is working on. Do you want to add anything on that, James?
Sorry, I was just taking a lot of notes here. I'm learning a lot from both Fifi and Joanne here, and from you, Annette. But yeah, I mean, bottom line, we're talking about responsible resource extraction without exacerbating human security challenges that are already existing in those zones. Yeah, it certainly is a complex dilemma, complex security dilemma, where you try and deal with one area of security, and the way in which you do so could make things worse in other areas of security. And so you really have to sort of think multi-layer and how they're all interconnected.
Thank you so much. We don't have much time left, but I want to make sure to also get to another question here for Fifi, which kind of brings us back to where you started when you talked about the importance of also using the academic work for policy, and also of kind of the interactions between academics and policymakers and practitioners. And I think especially also the students in the audience will find this really helpful and useful to think about potentially future careers, but also for us now to know how we can make the research that we are conducting actually most helpful. Do you have any views or suggestions in terms of what are the gaps here between academia and policy that requires most attention, or how we can work better together in order to address all of these issues that we've just discussed, or at least some of them?
Now, I think there's a need for further research in some of these areas that we've identified, because it is the research that is going to fall into policy changes and is going to bring about some of addressing some of the gaps that we've already identified. Because I think we are very good at identifying all of the gaps, and since we've been speaking the last hour or so, we've clearly identified almost all of the gaps that exist within the global security landscape. But the depths of these gaps and how pronounced they are what we are not so clear in terms of how to sort of define some of these threats and be able to deal with it. So, and that is where academia comes in, that we will be able to use the resources to be able to generate knowledge that will help to plug in this sort of gap. And I think that is where we need to perhaps work together, because there's a lot of knowledge out there, and especially from those from the African continent. Sometimes there's this perception that we do not have enough knowledge to be able to help address some of the challenges that we are confronted with on our continent. Perhaps we have not written about those knowledges, or perhaps we have not documented it well enough for it to be appreciated out there. But there are definitely local knowledge that can help us to be able to address some of the challenges that we are. And for me, that is where the role of researchers, the role of academics come in strongly. So there should be that kind of connection between academia and then also practitioners, and then also with some of the civil society organizations to be able to help address those kind of knowledge gaps that we have identified within the space.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Fifi. I see Joanne wants to jump in on this point from the MOD perspective, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to talk more from my personal perspective, which is rather than just purely MOD. And I'm coming at this from the vantage point of, I'm now a policy practitioner. Prior to this, I was a consultant researcher. I've worked with academics, I've worked with civil society. I've done the policy advocacy from being an external academic or an external policy specialist within an NGO. And now I'm on the other side in defense, being the one kind of having to do policy. And actually kind of one of the things we want to do, and we do, is reach out to academia, and we reach out to civil society and NGOs and experts to get their input. One of the biggest barriers is actually very few people that we engage with fully appreciate how policy is created. That's actually a real barrier to being able to give good policy advice. When we have NGOs who are trying to talk about kind of human rights or international humanitarian law, or we had a roundtable on conflict-related sexual violence last year. What more should the defence instrument, British defence instrument, what more should we be doing to tackle conflict-related sexual violence, for example? And actually, the biggest barrier was the fact that people don't know how a military actor works or operates, or what we can or can't do, and what the barriers and opportunities are. And so we ended up trying to ascertain expert advice from externals to bring that into the policy space, and we couldn't. So I would actually really encourage a revolving door between academia, between research and policymakers. I think it's hard to do or translate or to present academic research in ways that really have valuable policy traction, unless maybe you've been in a policy space. I think it's hard to influence a military actor. And I say this bit from personal experience because I'm not military, I'm civilian, but even just coming in as a civilian, engaging with military people with military mindsets, how do you communicate that with that particular audience in mind? And I don't think that necessarily academics or researchers necessarily communicate in ways that build that traction. So if I was to say, if people are trying to find more effective ways of being academics, researchers are having their work translate into the policy arena. That's the area that I would bridge, having greater awareness of how decision making is done within, whether that's defense or whether that's FCDO or any other kind of policy making body.
Thank you so much. Thanks. That's definitely very useful advice. And I guess what we could add here is that it really needs to go both ways, right? It's not just academics advising policy or policy practitioners, policymakers speaking to academics. It's going both ways. And I would say one important part here is also just the listening factor. It's not just about advising and influencing. It's first of all listening, understanding what the other side has to say or how things are working, as you say, how policies are being created, and vice versa, how research is being conducted. So having this both-way communication that includes listening is certainly very, very important. We've come to the end of this webinar, but I just wanted to very quickly ask each of the panelists if you have any recommendation for our audience members here. If there's a book, a publication, a podcast, or any other format that you would recommend to the audience as something that helps our understanding of the future or futures of global security from your particular point of view. James, do you want to start?
Okay, there are several different categories you could recommend books and podcasts for. I'll just kind of recommend a few. War on the Rocks podcast I found to be a great information source. They have weekly articles as well. They publish online. The Irregular Warfare Institute has a podcast series. It's really good. For those interested in studying terrorism, the journal that I edit is Perspectives on Terrorism, and I recommend that, of course, and also the CTC Sentinel at the U.S. Military Academy, West Point, the Combating Terrorism Center. The Sentinel has been a great monthly publication which connects practitioners and academics. And in terms of great power competition, I would certainly recommend Graham Allison's book, Destined for War. He addresses the Thucydides trap, which again addresses some of the uncertainty concerns that I mentioned earlier. And finally, I would just say I recommend students look at some fiction books, especially some of the books like Ghost Fleet and Burn In. These are books by August Cole and P.W. Singer, which look at future conflict and incorporate technologies that are either in development or are emerging right now, like hypersonic missiles and cyber kinds of robotics and other kinds of things as well. So it doesn't mean you can't read fiction if you're going to be in this space. You certainly recommend some good fiction books as well.
Great, thanks. Definitely to put on the reading list for the next holidays as well. Great. Thank you so much. Fifi, any recommendations?
I have just two. The very first one is the annual review of peace support operations that is periodically published by the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center. It picks different issues around global security, and then also sometimes focus extensively on different regions within Africa. And so this is perhaps something that people can read and we have a lot of ideas from. The second one is a journal that is published by the African Center for the Study and Research into Terrorism and Violent Extremism. I think the center is based in Algiers, and they also do quite some extensive work on the continent, particularly relating to issues of terrorism, violent extremism, and how different partners, both multilateral and bilateral partners, contribute to some of the things that are happening on the continent, particularly in the Sahel. So I think those are the two that I recommend.
Fantastic, thank you. Joanne?
Thanks. I'm not going to be very creative on this. I was actually going to say War on the Rocks as well. The other one that is a bit of a go-to is Crisis Group. I regularly rely on their Fawn podcasts, but just their general podcasts on crisis and conflict, I think, are just always wonderful summaries of what's going on. I think where I would encourage people to read and read more on is on futures. So futures foresight and horizon scanning. I don't know whether some of the our development concepts and doctrine center work is in public domain. But if you can give that a Google, sorry, I'm not being very helpful, it's worth looking at some of the futures work, because that's starting to think about, okay, where are we going to be in 20 years from now, to enable us to start thinking in the immediacy, how we need to position ourselves and looking at that going forward.
Right, thanks. So both fiction, as James mentioned, and of course, foresight, trend analysis, futures is very important to think about potential scenarios. But thank you so much. This is the closing roundtable of this webinar series, but we'll be back with more. Watch out for follow-on events and publications in the next term. And also we'll put another podcast to look out for. We'll have the podcast of this session today and of the previous ones soon on our website, where we'll also put together a reading list with all of the materials that have been recommended. So thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. We have lots of new questions, but that is definitely a good thing, and also many insights that will help us to study the future of global security. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Goodbye.